name is Jackie, and today I'll be analyzing my 2019 National Final Round speech in US Extemporaneous speaking. For those of you that don't know, US Extemp is an event where you basically have 30 minutes to write, prepare, and memorize a 7-minute speech on a current event. In this case, it'll be a domestic current events. And so my question was, how can Democrats change the minds of those who voted for Trump in 2016?
When TV host Oprah Winfrey announced that she might be seeking election in 2020, then Press Secretary Sean Spicer rejected claims that she might be able to win, saying that she didn't have political experience. Because let's face it, a billionaire celebrity who has a reality TV show but no political experience could just never become president.
So this is the first part of the introduction. It's commonly known as an attention-getting device, or AGD. If you've ever written an essay or you've been taught like a structure to write an essay, you also have these in essays. It's generally meant to hook the attention of a judge. In this case, mine is funny. It doesn't always have to be funny. Sometimes it can be sad, it can be, like surprising, it can be intriguing. But generally, most people opt to use funny AGDs just because they tend to be the most successful.
But if Oprah was willing to challenge Trump, then it shows that Trump might have to be worried about 2020. Because the Cook Political Report writes, on May 7th of 2019, is that, let's face it, Democrats might not be able to win over most Trump voters. But there's one key demographic that they might be able to win: anti-elites, or the working class of America who feel that big corporations are trampling over them. This demographic voted incredibly for President Trump in 2016, but they're willing to vote for Democrats in 2020.
So what I just did here is, after I gave my AGD, I gave what's known as a link, which basically ties my AGD, which was about Oprah, into my actual topic. And this is something that you want to make sure you do. Like, you can't just give a joke or give an analogy and then jump right into your topic. You have to explain how your joke or analogy relates to your actual topic at hand. And then I gave a background, which is basically me explaining the context of the question. Why is the question being asked? Or what, not only not why the question is being asked, but more what is the question? What exactly has happened that is related to the question? What kind of background information does the judge need in order to understand my speech? And you'll notice that here I didn't opt to give a lot of background information that was super basic. I assumed that my judge would know who President Trump was. I assumed they know who the Democrats were. And so I didn't give a lot of background information that I think in other speeches where you have different countries, in some international extemporaneous speeches, you have different countries, different leaders, etc., you might have to explain a little bit more of the background. But here, because I was given such a broad question, I felt I didn't have to explain the background as much. So you'll also notice that I, along with my background, added a source, the Cook Political Report. You generally want to do this with your background, just as a way of bolstering your own credibility, by explaining some of the context behind the question.
And considering that it may not feel like it, but although the presidential election is more than a year away, Democrats need to start planning now if they want to take back the White House. It becomes incredibly imperative that we ask ourselves today's question: how can Democrats change the minds of those who voted for Trump in 2016? The answer is by capitalizing on his vulnerability among these working class voters. First, by adopting a stronger stance on trade. Second, by emphasizing worker training programs and green technology plans. And finally, by targeting their brand of economic populism to rural America.
So these are the last 4 parts of the introduction. There are 7 parts in total. We've gone over 3, so that'd be the AGD, the link, and the background. So then I say the statement of significance, which is basically me explaining why this question is important. Why does this question matter to the judge, right? It gives the judge a reason to be interested in your question. So I said something about if the Democrats want to take back office in 2020, generally the statement will boil down to lives lost, power shifts, money, very tangible things that people ultimately care about. Then I have my question. You want to make sure you say this word for word, exactly word for word, because the changing of one word may change the meaning of your question, so you don't want to do that. Then I have my answer, which is sort of a broad, it's called an umbrella answer. It's a broad, general answer to my question, which is to focus on these working class voters. And then I gave my preview, which is just a preview of the 3 points in my speech. And so the general structure of an extemp speech, and if you've ever written essays, again, it's very similar. So you have an introduction, 3 points, and conclusion. And each of the 3 points, you're gonna have a tag, which is basically like a phrase or a couple of words describing the essence of your point. And so here I'm saying my 3 tags in order. You should say them in the order that you're going to give the points, which is my preview. So these are the 7 parts of the introduction: AGD, link, background, statement of significance, question, answer, preview. These are generally pretty standard. Most introductions will have all 7 of these parts. Your introduction also time-wise should run about 1:30. I think I go maybe slightly over 1:30. You want to hit the question at 1 minute, just to allot enough times to later when you have to give your actual points.
Recently, CNN did an interview segment where they asked some people which country we got independence from in 1776. And a lot of people didn't know, with some people answering that we got independence from China. The two of you not laughing in the second row, I'm a little concerned for you. But it seems that if China didn't literally own us, they're figuratively owning us. Because the first way that Democrats can win over Trump voters is that they need to adopt a stronger stance on trade.
So the beginning of every point is going to look something like this. Normally you'll have a transition. It can be a joke, it can be a bit of background information. This is not strictly necessary. Like if you're running out of time, you can probably cut this. If you're just starting out, you don't have enough time to think of transitions, you don't need it. It's not strictly necessary, but it's just something that adds a little bit of flavor and spice and, opportunities for humor in your speech. Then after you say your transition, you want to, again, link it to your actual point. So make sure you explain why your transition has to do with your point. And then you give the tag of your point. You say the first reason or the first step or the first way. And then you say the question, and then the first way that blah, blah, blah is blah, 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 and you say your tag here.
What the New York Times writes on April 6th of 2019 is that Trump won the farmer vote by 67%. But since then, by engaging in a trade war with China that has seen China put tariffs of 15% on all American agricultural imports, farmer bankruptcies in the Midwest have more than doubled since 2016. Unfortunately, Democrats aren't taking advantage of this because they're making the same mistakes as President Trump. What the Washington Post writes on May 12th of 2019 is that, for example, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, 2 of the 3 Democratic frontrunners in 2020, both want more tariffs, a message that isn't going to appeal to the agricultural industry. But if Democrats want to win key states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, 3 states that voted overwhelmingly for Trump but are usually pretty democratic, they need to adopt a stronger stance on trade in order to change the minds of these Trump voters.
So a couple of things I want to know about this point. First of all, you'll notice that while it is like a pretty straightforward point, like I'm sort of just saying like, okay, Trump, likes tariffs. Well, that has hurt him, and so Democrats should support trade, or at the very least, be against tariffs. I think that something here that is good to know is that I use a lot of specifics, right? In the beginning, I cite New York Times, I use a lot of statistics on farmers and farm bankruptcies and tariffs. And then in the second half of the speech, I talk about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And one thing that I will say is like super common for people who are just starting out in extemp is they wonder why they're not hitting 7 minutes because their speeches are running short. And it's oftentimes because they're not including these statistics or these examples that can often serve as evidence for your argument. So you really want to make sure that you're doing that. Finally, at the end of the point, I sort of bring it back to the language of the question. So I say like, therefore, if Democrats, support trade or oppose Trump on trade, then they'll be able to change the mind of those who voted for Trump or something. Bring back the language of the question allows you to sort of not only tie up the point and tell the judge with a bit of finality, you tell the judge okay, this is my point, I'm moving on to the second point. It also reminds the judge what your point is, right? You've just given a minute and 40 seconds worth of material. You want to remind the judge why you're making these arguments, right? The point is you want to answer the question, so you want to sort of come back to the question a little bit. So as I mentioned before, your first point and all 3 of your points should run about 1:40. I would say you should move on to your second point when you see the 4. So when they're giving you time signals, they'll tell you 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left, 3 minutes left, 2, 1. 30 seconds left, 15 seconds left, time's up, I have 7 minutes. You generally want to start moving on when you see the 4 minutes. So when you have 4 minutes left, you should be moving on.
Despite the best efforts of our educational system, 1 in 4 Americans believe that the sun revolves around the earth. And one very prominent American believes that the sun revolves around himself. But his disregard for climate science might be his undoing, because the second way that Democrats can win over Trump voters in 2020 is that they need to emphasize worker training plans when they're pushing for green technology.
So same structure here. I give a transition, I give a link, and then I give my tag. Same structure.
What the Hill reports on May 12th of 2019 is that in 2016, Trump won coal voters by a huge majority in places like West Virginia. But he's trying to prop up a naturally declining industry because US coal consumption dropped by more than 4% in 2017. But while Democrats have a more sustainable strategy of pushing for green energy, unfortunately, they're not including training for the workers who used to work in coal mines who will now be left behind by this push. And as a result, these people feel that they have to put their hope in President Trump. But in order to win key states like West Virginia, Democrats need to emphasize worker training plans when they talk about renewable energy, because only then will these voters realize that, hey, maybe the Democrats actually have a better long-term strategy for my economic security, demonstrating that Democrats need to emphasize this aspect of green technology if they want to win over these voters in 2020.
So one thing you'll notice with this point is that it's not something, it's a slightly more complex point than the first point, right? Like the first point you can probably find in most major newspapers. The second point you're not going to find in most major newspapers. I don't think it's something that it's not as well known as the trade aspect. It's a little bit less discussed. And so one thing you want to make sure with Extemp, and something that I do see a lot with people who are just starting out, is they give points that are very straightforward, very common knowledge, very safe points. And while these are probably going to be correct, you're not going to mess up with these points, oftentimes you're not teaching the judge anything, the judge isn't learning anything, and so sometimes these speeches will get ranked poorly and people won't understand why. They'll be like, well, I gave a solid speech with 3 points, that made sense. Yes, but someone else is giving a speech with 3 points, but the judge is actually learning something from their speech. So I would encourage you to, when you're coming up with your points, to explore things that are maybe riskier, more complex, less well known, but are going to teach the judge something at the end of the day, right? If you can make a very convincing argument here, then ultimately you're going to be able to, teach the judge something that's going to make you stand out much more. One thing that I will say that I wish I had done better with this point specifically, is I didn't mention why coal voters were important. I think the only state I brought up was West Virginia. Ideally, I could have brought up more states, I could have brought up more statistics. And when you do have a complex point like this, you want to make sure you go the extra mile to prove that you're right. And so I feel like I could have done better on the tail end of the point here. So that's something to keep in mind when you're giving points, is make sure if you are giving a more complex, less well-known point, that you sort of go the extra mile to prove it.
But while Democrats have long relied on cities and suburban areas to capture their vote, they've traditionally ignored rural America. But the third and final way that Democrats can capture those who voted for Trump in 2016 is by targeting their brand of economic populism specifically to rural areas.
So same structure here. I have a transition. I opt not to use a joke, which more on that later. I opt not to use a joke, and then I give a little bit of background information on the Democratic political strategy, which I think is pretty well known, and then I give my tag. So the reason why I don't give a joke here is because I actually, as I'm transitioning, I forgot the joke. I did have one, and I remembered it later. I remembered it literally a split second later, but I forgot it. And so I came up with a sentence about Democrats and cities completely on the fly. I hadn't planned that line at all, but I forgot my joke. And at this point, I was also running a little bit short on time. I think generally you want to move out of the second point when you see the 3, you have like 2 or 3 more sentences, and then you should move out of your second point. I think that I was running a little bit short on time at this point, so I kind of wanted to keep it short. I didn't want to have to spend 20 seconds setting up another joke, so I sort of opted to give a simpler transition. This is a completely on the fly decision. It was made on the spot. So what I want to emphasize here is, one, be flexible. Things are going to happen in speeches and you have to be able to adjust, right? Like, don't let things fluster you or throw you off. Don't feel like you have to adhere to the rigid structure that you planned out in prep, because oftentimes, you're going to have to be flexible and make decisions like this where you change things that you say based on what's happening in the round. The second thing is, if something like this does happen, try not to get flustered. I think at this point I was slightly panicked. Like, at this point, what's in my mind is I botched the execution of the first joke. I, underproved the second point, and now I forgot the third joke. And so I'm quite panicked here, actually. I don't think you can tell. I don't think any of the judges could tell, but I am a little bit panicked here, but I'm trying not to I'm trying not to get flustered. And that's super important, right? Like, your judge should not be able to tell if you're panicked. Like, maybe you are panicked, and that's fine, but try to stay calm on the outside, because the minute you get panicked and flustered, that's sort of when things turn into a mess and they snowball and you end up giving a pretty bad speech. So make sure you sort of just stay calm, keep your composure, and try to adapt, and that's pretty much what I tried to do here. And I think, you can't tell I'm that panicked, I think, so hopefully it turned out fine.
What Politico News explains on May 24th of 2019 is that rural America is traditionally a Republican stronghold, but they also believe in economic populism because they like things like more healthcare coverage or fixing the opioid epidemic.
One thing I want to stress here, and I haven't stressed so far, is that for every single point, you want to have two sources backing you up, reputable sources. So I think at the first point, I had New York Times and Washington Post. Second point, I think I had The Hill, and I didn't cite a second source for my second point. I definitely had one, but I just was nervous and forgot. But you generally want to make sure you have two sources. You have two sources per point.
But while most Democrats running in 2020 have focused their message on urban areas, some Democrats have won in rural areas. For example, a Democrat named Connor Lamb won a rural Pennsylvania district despite the fact that it was traditionally a Republican stronghold. And that's because he emphasized a message of populism by advocating, for example, for a plan to fix the opioid crisis. But he targeted it specifically at rural America and not just at urban America, which is already a Democratic stronghold. Democrats need to adopt this strategy into a nationwide plan if they want to capture working-class rural America who don't exactly feel great about Trump's attempts to repeal healthcare, demonstrating that this is a strategy Democrats need to adopt in order to win Trump voters in 2020.
So again, you'll notice that I use a very specific example. I bring up Connor Lamb, who's a Democrat who wanted a traditional Republican stronghold. These are the types of examples and evidence that are not only going to make your point stronger, but ensure that your point, runs the full 1 minute 40 seconds without you rambling on and trying to find something to talk about. You'll notice I tie back the point. I bring in the language of the question at the end. So, each point, while it does seem difficult on the surface, each point is fairly simple. You follow a structure, you follow sort of a playbook, and then if you give the right evidence of the statistics and you do the things that you need to do, then you're going to give a good speech. And so ultimately, you'll notice the structure of each point is pretty similar. One thing I want to do stress now is you'll notice that at the end of most, or in most of the points, I make a couple of fluency stumbles here and there. They're not big, they're just kind of small, like me not being able to enunciate properly. And I feel like most extempers, when they start out, they're trying to focus on oh my god, how can I improve my fluency, right? And what I would say to that is, number one, what I just said before about including evidence and statistics is going to really improve your fluency, because while it may not seem like it, lack of content is a huge driver of fluency stumbles, because if you don't have anything to say, you have to ramble on and repeat yourself and find new ways to say things you already said before, and that's going to cause a lot of fluency breaks. So just having things to talk about is going to be able to improve your fluency. But the second thing is, if you do make a fluency break, and they happen a lot. I have given very few speeches where I've gone the entire speech without a single fluency break. Don't get flustered. Just keep your calm and move on. Know that it's completely natural. But if the judge is not going to notice a fluency break. If you get flustered and make 5 other fluency breaks because of it, that's when the judge is going to notice. So remember to keep your calm. Don't let a fluency break sort of fluster you or get into your mind. The last thing I'm going to say about fluency here is for a lot of extempers, especially those who are beginning out, I think they think that, oh my god, in order to have good fluency, I should write out every single word in my speech and I should memorize the entire thing. Like the more words I write, the better. And I would actually say the opposite is generally true. I would say if you write out your entire speech, so number one, you're not going to have time to write every word that you're going to give in your speech. Like it just is impossible in 30 minutes. The second thing I would say is if I were given my typed out version of the speech complete with sentences and told to memorize it, or I was given an outline and told to memorize it, I would definitely pick the outline over the actual typed out speech. And the reason for this is if you give me my entire typed out speech and tell me to memorize it, I'm focusing more on the words that I'm using rather than the argument that I'm trying to convey. And when you do that, you oftentimes will lose sight of the argument, so you will forget like what your next argument is, or you will forget the chain of argumentation that you're trying to explain. You will also, if you make a stumble and you deviate a little bit from the script, you are going to be way more flustered. You're going to try to remember, oh my god, what do I have to say next? Like, what was I supposed to say next? And that's going to mess up your fluency a lot. Whereas if you just have an outline, you know, you're focused much more on the argument that you're trying to convey, so you're not focusing on the words you're using. And paradoxically, that makes your fluency a lot better because in normal conversation, when we're just talking with each other, we're not thinking about like, oh my god, I have to say the word the, and then, you know, president, and then said. Like, we're not thinking about that. We're thinking of the argument we're trying to convey, and then we're naturally describing the argument. And I think that when extempers try to focus too much on like the words they use as opposed to the arguments they convey, that's when they get tripped up in fluency. So if you find that you're getting tripped up in fluency a lot, you're making a lot of fluency breaks, it might be because in your mind you're trying to think of the next sentence you're trying to say or the next word as opposed to the next argument. So I would encourage you to step back a little bit and adopt a pretty broad view of fluency. The last thing I'm going to say is I've given my 3 points. Now it's the conclusion. This is like the last 30 seconds of your speech.
Democrats may have long complained about Trump's 4 years, but they better change if they don't want another 4. And so we return to today's question. How can Democrats change the minds of those who voted for Trump in 2016? The answer is that they have to capitalize among his vulnerability among working class voters. First, by adopting a tougher stance on China and their trade war. Second, by emphasizing worker training in green tech programs. And finally, by targeting their message to rural America. So while Democrats may feel that Trump has been pretty unfair in 2016 to 2020, their current strategy will only see Trump in another 4 years in the White House.
So you notice that the structure of the conclusion is actually incredibly similar to the last part of the introduction. So I start with a basic summarization of my statement of significance. This is not necessary. Like a lot of people just say in conclusion. I think it makes me sound a little less formulaic, but obviously it doesn't work for everyone. Then you say your question, again, word for word, answer, preview, and then you will give a statement that either ties back to your AGD, sort of like full circle, or is going to be able to sort of add an element of finality to the end of your speech. So it's going to be some sentence that adds like it's like the final sentence you say in your speech. And I think a mistake I make here, and one that's a little bit more evident than the mistakes that I've talked about already, is I didn't actually plan out the last line. This is completely on the spot, made up. You generally want to plan this out. And I was super bad about this as an extemper. I never planned these out, and I should have in retrospect. But it is the last line you're saying, right? You want it to be memorable. You've just given a great speech. Like, you don't want your last sentence to mess things up. And so I would highly recommend that you plan this out, just because I think that will help you give a much more solid speech. Extempers usually don't plan this out, and I think if you do, it'll help avoid that like moment of panic at the end when you don't know what to say. So that's my speech. It runs 7 minutes, a couple seconds over 7 minutes maybe. And so I guess the main takeaways here are, if you're just getting started in Extemp, you should know the basic structure. We've gone over the basic structure of an Extemp speech and some tips to improve, you know, like when you're starting out your fluency or your delivery, or like how to be able to hook the judge's attention. So for people who are considering getting into Extemp or have just gotten Extemp and are unsure, you know, how to improve, some things I would recommend is, number one, I would recommend giving practice speeches very often. This is just repetition is going to help make your fluency much better. It's going to help you get more used to giving an Extemp speech more quickly. And the second thing I would do is, watch a lot of speeches. So the NSDA does a very good job of providing a lot of online resources for extempers. You know, you can, if your school has the resource package, you're going to be able to see all of their speeches from like the 1900s onward. If you don't, like, all of the speeches here are released. I would highly recommend for you to look through all of them, just to get an idea of like what makes people succeed. And keep in mind that like what may work for one person might not work for you, right? Like self-deprecating jokes never work for me, so I never use them, but they may work for other people and other people will use them. And so keep in mind that you want to find things that are true to you and your personality and your style. Like, don't import things that from other people that you don't think are going to work with you. And the last thing I would say is for people who are just getting into the event, especially on the content side, I think in order to be able to think of points quickly, you should be reading the news a lot. So you should be reading, I would recommend reading the news at least 15 minutes a day, if not more, from multiple news sources. For domestic extempers, I think you should know most major current events. You should be able to describe most major national issues. For example, like when I saw this question, I immediately thought of Connor Lamb because I'd read about him in the news beforehand. So that helped me come up with that point rather quickly. Whereas if you don't know anything about the topic you're talking about, you have to waste so much time in your prep time looking up the background of the question. And hopefully after watching this video, you like Extemp. If you haven't tried it out, hopefully you want to try it out. And yeah, I'll see you guys later.